Good morning and welcome to Semel Institute Grand Rounds. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Adriana Galvan. Dr. Galvan is a professor of psychology and the Dean of Undergraduate Education at UCLA. In addition, she is co-executive director of the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent. Dr. Galvan's scholarly work focuses on the adolescent brain and development and behavior. She has a particular focus on motivation, learning, and risk-taking with an eye towards science that informs youth-relevant policy. Dr. Galvan received her bachelor's degree from Barnard, her PhD in neuroscience from Cornell, and she's the recipient of a slew of awards, including those from the National Academy of Sciences, Fulbright, the American Psychological Association, and the Presidential Early Career Award. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome this morning. Thank you, Dr. Galvan.
Thank you, Dr. Farah. Such a nice introduction. Bear with me as I share my screen. Okay, unless someone says otherwise, I'm assuming that you can see the slides that say learning and anxiety in the adolescent brain. It's a pleasure to be here today to give grand rounds, and I'll be talking a bit about research we've been doing to study the typically developing adolescent brain, as well as youth who present with anxiety symptoms. It's long been known that the brain changes a lot postnatally. During the early first years of life, brain development and plasticity is what helps make us human. We learn how to walk, how to talk, how to bond with caregivers, and all of that happens because the brain is highly plastic. It wasn't until about 10 to 15 years ago that we started learning more about the adolescent brain and have since learned that this too is a time of plasticity. Some call it the second wave of plasticity. And with these with plasticity, adolescents are also able to take in information from the environment and use it to modify their behavior or find new interests, or perhaps most importantly, leave the natal group. Perhaps what's been most refreshing about research on adolescence in the past decade has been a narrative shift about adolescence. In the early years of fMRI studies on the adolescent brain, a lot of the work focused on risk-taking and poor choices that adolescents make. And certainly there's still that element in the literature. But now we're starting to appreciate how important this time in life is from a neurobiological perspective. Changes in the brain allow adolescents to form new social bonds, to explore their academic interests, their career interests, and most importantly, to gain the confidence to transition into adulthood. And in fact, adolescence is a time of remarkable opportunity. It's no longer considered to just be the ages between 13 and 17, often called the teenage years. But now we know that the changes that happen in the brain occur from about age 10, when puberty strikes, through about the mid-20s. And what that means is not that the brain is changing in size as it does earlier in life, but more so that the changes that are occurring are in the connections among brain regions, how the brain responds to the environment, and the new abilities that come with this increased maturation. And importantly, during this time, we discover, we learn from, and we adapt to the world around us. In this image, you can see the broad span of adolescence, spanning from early adolescence at about age 10 through young adulthood through about age 25. In today's talk, I'll give you some data that we've collected and others have collected on the adolescent brain, but I want you to keep in mind a few caveats. The first is that there's vast variation in the adolescent brain. So if we were in person, I would ask you how old you think these kids are and what grade they're in. But I'll just tell you that all of them, even though they look so different, all of them are 14 years old and in 8th grade. And I hope that you can appreciate how physically different these kids are from each other. Some of them look like they're in high school and some of them look like they're in 3rd grade. And this just illustrates that age is a really imprecise way to think about someone's capabilities and where they may be neurobiologically. The second important thing to keep in mind about adolescence is that it is a moving target, of course. And certainly across successive generations, what adolescents do, what adolescents are motivated to do has changed with input from the environment. So these are data from over 8 million adolescents collected all across the country, starting in the mid-70s. And adolescents were simply asked to endorse whether or not they engaged in these behaviors, getting a driver's license, trying alcohol, dating, or working for pay. And you can see that in the mid-70s and through the mid-90s, endorsement of these behaviors was rather high. But then in the mid-90s or early 2000s, these behaviors dropped precipitously. Adolescents were endorsing driving, trying alcohol, and dating significantly less, and working for pay even less so. The authors speculate about the reasons why. The onset of the internet and social media is certainly one explanation, but all this is to say that how we treat adolescents needs to be considered in a dynamic fashion in response to the needs and the behaviors of adolescents. And finally, I'll note that although 25% of the world's population falls within this adolescent range, 9/10 live in low and middle income countries of this 25%. And yet 90% of current data about adolescence comes from high income countries. So certainly we can do a better job of being inclusive to the adolescent experience across the world. But often we are limited, particularly in neuroscience, to the tools that are available, and imaging tools tend to be clustered in the United States, England, and Australia. So most of these data come from those countries. So what changes during adolescence? A lot. This picture illustrates how hormone release that happens, as I mentioned, around age 10, and often and sometimes earlier in certain ethnic groups. The pituitary gland releases adrenal hormones that influence biological changes such as height and weight, but also social and behavioral changes. So social proclivities change, as well as what adolescents are more inclined to do, such as seek out rewards, take risks, etc. As I previously mentioned, the second wave of plasticity leads to increased sensitivity to the environment. Relationships continue to expand. Contrary to popular belief, it's not the case that adolescents only care about their friends and their peers. They continue to care about what their parents and other caregivers think. However, their social circles expand, and so they learn to navigate new social landscapes. Autonomy and social integration are key components of adolescent development. That is becoming an autonomous being, and that's relevant for our discussion of anxiety today, given some of the characteristics that you need in order to become autonomous from caregivers. And finally, it's a time of intense identity formation. I think all of us can remember that we tried on different hats as we were navigating our way through adolescence, and this is a key part of this period of life. Importantly, the adolescent brain is well suited to these developmental tasks, and I won't go through all the findings, I'll just summarize here. The first finding that the field really agreed upon is that the prefrontal cortex shows a protracted development, and you probably already know that. The reason that's important is because of the prefrontal cortex's role in judgment, in decision making, in thinking about the future. And importantly, it's not the case that the prefrontal cortex changes in isolation, but that the connections it has with other brain regions also changes. As kids become adolescents, they become better able to, for example, regulate emotional systems because the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system are more connected. Motivation and reward systems are more active. This is what probably gives rise to the increases in risk-taking behavior and reward-seeking behavior. But importantly, this also helps adolescents explore their environment, to have more flexible learning that I'll describe later, and overall give them a sense of agency. Now, we all know that adolescents make risky decisions. And in fact, the bad rap that they've often gotten has been because they tend to make more risky decisions or feel more comfortable taking risks than adults or than younger children. However, not all adolescents make risky decisions, and characterizing all of them as such is actually doing them a disservice, because then we're unable to capture the nuances in behavior that are so common. And incidentally, not all risky decisions are concerning. if you get one thing from my talk today is that risk-taking is adaptive, obviously in healthy contexts and in healthy outlets. But this type of risk-taking behavior is important because it allows adolescents to learn through trial and error. And that's often how we learn throughout life. When we're babies, we learn how to walk through trial and error. Obviously, no one walks us through, no one tells us exactly how to do it, and we just simply have to try. Adolescents are similarly trying on different behaviors during this time. And in fact, when there's risk avoidant behavior, I don't need to explain to this group that can lead to anxiety symptoms. As you know, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health condition among children and adolescents with high prevalence rates. And one of the cardinal features of anxiety is avoidance of stimuli that are deemed threatening or dangerous. And some of the work that I'll describe today aims to uncover the spectrum and the continuum of avoidant behavior all the way up through risk-taking behavior. So this work arose from conversations I had when I was a postdoc here with Dr. Tara Paris, and we came at this question of adolescent and characteristic adolescent phenotypes from different perspectives. So we noticed that how interesting it is that adolescence gives rise to seemingly contrasting phenotypes. On the one hand, there's an uptick in anxiety characterized by avoidance and inhibition. But on the other hand, adolescents are also characterized by increases in risk-seeking behavior. So how does the brain reconcile these things? And interestingly, are there same neural circuits that govern both of these extreme forms of behavior, or these behaviors that are on a continuum? So we gathered pilot data over a few years, and eventually we got funded to execute what we call the DAYS study, the Development of Anxiety in Youth Study. And this, I have to say, has been such a pleasure to work with Tara on this project because of her expertise in anxiety, and I've learned so much. I came to this project just wanting to know the kids who show atypical adolescent behavior, and so this has been a really fun project to work on, and we're still collecting the last wave of the data. We've had many wonderful people help us out. This is our current staff, including graduate students, lab managers, RAs, and many others who are not on this page, and we're deeply grateful for them, especially during the pandemic when they kept things running, and we're in the final and third wave of data collection. So earlier this year, Tara and I published a paper in Biological Psychiatry kind of outlining this idea of risk-taking in pediatric anxiety disorders. And with my graduate student, Amanda Baker, we also examined the neural mechanisms underlying the development of anxiety and risk-taking in adolescents. And in both of these papers, we illustrate the important role of the mesolimbic system in uncovering how these phenotypes arise, and often in the same person. A key feature of anxiety is avoidant behaviors, as I already mentioned. Now, and this is highly studied in pediatric anxiety, and many studies using brain imaging to study the adolescent brain focus in on avoidant behavior or threat sensitivity. Understudied in pediatric anxiety is a construct of risk-seeking behavior. Now, the reason this is important to appreciate is that although avoidant behavior may help avoid potential harm in individuals who feel extra worried about harm and threat, taking risks provides valuable opportunities for learning, for exploration, and mastery of new situations. And as I said in the beginning, these are all key developmental milestones that we all go through and that are important learning opportunities for individuals to transition into adulthood. I'm speaking of these in generalities, but certainly we know that both avoidant behavior and risk-seeking behavior are informed by individual differences in personality traits, environmental context, and certainly age. So I'll explain a little bit about the DAYS study from which a lot of these data come from. This study, we got over 180 participants in year one that are usable data. We enroll between the ages of 9 and 13 at year one and follow them for 3 years. We use the SCARED measure to determine anxiety, and they also get an interview. And as I mentioned before, this is a 3-year longitudinal study. So we don't just collect brain imaging, but we do computer tasks, blood, hormones, sleep, everything under the sun, because we're interested in identifying the antecedents of anxiety, or identifying which factors persist in, or which factors are stick out in individuals whose anxiety persists. So I'll get into a bit of the data. These data are under review, and they're led by our graduate students, Tanya and Amanda. We use the CUPS risky decision-making task, and I'll briefly review it for those of you unfamiliar with it. In this task, participants are given the choice of taking a risk or taking a non-risk. That's what's illustrated on the right. So when they're presented with these row of cups, if they choose the one on the left, that means that they get $2 for sure. That's a non-risky option. If they choose the cups on the right, it's a risky option because they have a 50-50 chance of the computer lifting up one of the cups to reveal $10 underneath it. On the left, what you'll see is that there's variation in the number of cups that will appear on the risky option side. A 50-50 chance means that there are 2 cups. If there are 3 cups, there's a 33% chance that they'll get the reward. And if they see 5 cups, there's a 20% chance that they'll get the reward. We also vary the amount of money under the cups on the risky side. $4, $6, and $10 is what they're presented with. The reason we do this is because it allows us to parse out the trials into those that are advantageous, that is, you should take the risk, neutral trials, that is, whether you take the risky or non-risky option doesn't really matter from an economic perspective, or there are disadvantageous trials, meaning that you should not take the risk. In our healthy populations, we find that adolescents compared to adults are more likely to take the advantageous risks, whereas the adults are more risk averse and they're more likely to not take the risk, even when it behooves them to do so. So this allows us to examine expected value as based on the probability of getting the reward and the amount of money they stand to gain. Now, for example, if you look at the first column here, the expected value is $2 the expected value is 2 if they choose to take the risk when there are 2 cups on the risky side. The expected value is 0.8 when there are 5 cups and $4. And so in this case, the participant should take the risk when it's a 50-50 chance, but not take the risk when it's a 20% chance. And like I mentioned before, this allows us to parse out the trials into advantageous trials, neutral trials, or disadvantageous trials. And the reason we were interested in this is because we want to know, do adolescents with anxiety or who vary on anxiety, are they equally likely to endorse or accept the risky trials when they are advantageous? Or is it the case that they always stay away from risk, even when they should actually be engaging in the risk? And are they more likely to avoid the disadvantageous risk trials compared to the non-anxious youth? So these data I'm showing, or these results I'm showing you, come from 155 participants. You can see the mean age, the anxiety severity is measured with the scared, and then the ethnic breakdown. These graphs here show you the same information, just in different ways. On the left, it's the table. On the right is the plot. And what this is telling us, and one thing I forgot to mention, this is a gain trial where they stand to gain money. We also have loss trials in which the cups are blue. And in this case, in the non-risky option, they lose $2 for sure. And in the risky option, there's a chance that they will or will not lose money. So they're trying to avoid losing, or losing as much as more than $2, whereas here they're looking to gain money. So if we focus on the plot on the right, what you can see is that all individuals take more of the advantageous risks, which is good because that tells us that they understood the task. Even if they're not explicitly calculating an expected value, their brain automatically does it. And this was across all adolescents. We also see that they are more likely to take advantageous risks in the gain trials. So the y-axis here is percent risks taken or accepted. And they're least likely to take a risk in the disadvantageous trials within the loss condition. And so all of this is to say that the task is working, that participants understood it, and that even as young as 9, remember, and that that they are aware of the differences in risk value. Now, how does anxiety symptom relate to this risk taking? So what I'm showing you here on the left are data from the gain frame. So remember, when they stand to gain money. The 3 different lines represent anxiety severity. Average is blue, less or 1 standard deviation less is in red, and those with the highest anxiety are in green. Expected value is on the y-axis. So basically, as expected value increases, you should be more likely you should endorse taking the risk. That's the optimal behavior. All of our participants, regardless of anxiety, show this pattern. Even those with the highest anxiety take the greatest risk when there's reason to do so, and you stand to gain money. And incidentally, I should say that they actually did earn the money we actually gave them the money that they earned on the task. So they were quite invested in performing well. What you're looking at now are data from the loss frame. So here what you can see is that it follows the same general pattern. However, now there are differences as based on anxiety severity. So the individuals with the highest anxiety in green were the least likely to take the risks even when they should have been taking the risks. That is, even when the expected value was high, they tended to avoid accepting that risky option because they were potentially going to lose more money. So this tells us that youth with the highest anxiety showed the least change in their decision-making probability. That is, they were most inflexible in their behavior in the loss condition, but not in the gain condition. So just to summarize this bit, youth took more risks in gains relative to loss trials, suggesting, as we have in prior work, that youth prioritize achieving rewards rather than avoiding punishments. Youth with the lowest anxiety took the most risks as a function of potential benefit, and that'll come up later when we talk about the value of an over-exaggerated striatum. Youth with higher anxiety were less likely to take advantageous risks during the loss trials. And differences in risk-taking as a function of anxiety only emerged when they were faced with this possible threat and not with the possible rewards. I think this is really interesting in light of the different types of risks we make in everyday life. Sometimes they're advantageous, so for example, maybe in social situations, and sometimes they're not. And identifying which those types of risks are is I think crucial for thinking about how we can help adolescents make healthy choices. And finally, by not flexibly adapting behavior according to the environmental context, the youth with anxiety may be missing opportunities for potential benefit. This actually nicely parallels the data that we collected in our pilot staging of this grant, where we collected data on a small group of youth with anxiety and non-anxious youth. And the data basically show the same. There was no using the CUPS task. There were no differences, if you look here in the gain percent risky choice, between risks accepted between the groups, but the anxious group made significantly less risky choices in the loss condition in this small study as well. And here we collected imaging data, and I won't walk through all the line graphs here, but just to illustrate the point that relative to the anxious group, the non-anxious youth had different patterns of activation, and they engaged different brain regions differently. So for example, the non-anxious youth showed greater engagement of the striatum in the gain condition, whereas the anxious group did not engage this mesolimbic circuitry during this decision-making phase. And I think that's consequential based on some data I'm going to show you in a second. Okay, so I made the point previously that taking risks, and even whether they're advantageous or not, provides valuable opportunities for learning. And if you take a risk and it's not advantageous, that provides the opportunity to learn from trial and error. Reward learning and this type of probabilistic learning means that we need to be comfortable with uncertainty. So when you're walking around in the world and you're trying to learn from the environment, you have to be, you're better able to learn from that environment if you're comfortable with not always knowing the outcome. And so intolerance of uncertainty or heightened threat monitoring can interfere with this normative process of adaptive behavior in response to reward learning. And it's much more challenging for stimulus reward associations to develop if you have this avoidance of uncertainty. So to that end, we've become interested in studying probabilistic reinforcement learning, which is one of the very foundational forms of learning. As I mentioned before, that's how babies learn to walk and to talk, and it's by trial and error when probabilities in the environment are variable. So in the day's sample, we are collecting fMRI data on this probabilistic reinforcement task. And it's a very simple task previously used in typically developing adolescents. And basically they're shown a stimulus shown on the left, and then they are asked to determine whether that stimulus belongs to what we call a northern state school or a southern state school. The details don't matter. It's basically asking them to classify the stimulus into one bin or another. And every time they make a choice, they are told whether they are correct or incorrect. So for example, if I see this purple circle and I say, I think that goes in the northern bin and I'm correct, I get a little coin. If I say that it's a northern, in the northern category and it's wrong, I don't get any money. So they're getting feedback. And through this feedback, they are to learn the association between the purple circle and the northern bin. Now, the catch and what makes it probabilistic is that the stimuli are predictive 83% of the time. So stimuli in the predictive bin are predictive 83% of the time. That means that most of the time that I choose northern, I'm going to be correct. The reason it's not 100% of the time is because then it wouldn't be probabilistic. There wouldn't be this type of learning going on across the entire task. The non-predictive stimuli are identified as such because you're only right 50-50% of the time. So in any environment, if you're only right 50-50 for half the time, you're not going to learn that association because it's not consistent. So employing a task with variable reward probabilities allows us to examine how predictability of rewards relates to anxiety. Now, coming back to anxiety in real life, we know that predictability is very comforting for individuals with anxiety. They do not want the unpredictability. The intolerance of uncertainty makes it challenging to feel comfortable in unpredictable circumstances. So we were interested in how predictability of the reward may or may not relate to anxiety. The data from the study include 137 participants, and the other factors are the same. This study was pre-registered here, so if you're interested, you can look at all the methods and the details. So we captured a few learning and brain metrics. We relied on the Rescorla-Wagner model, which is, as you know, a typical model to index reinforcement learning and relationships between choices, and both prediction error, which is the difference between expected and actual reward. And this is important here because remember, most of the time they're going to have a positive prediction or prediction error that matches their expectation. But on the predictive trials where sometimes they're told they're wrong, that's a negative prediction error, and that gives them more information about the association. We also modeled decision value. So this is simply the value associated with a given stimulus. So you can imagine that when you have a predictive stimulus, you assign a greater decision value weight to it because you can rely on the outcome. So even if it's only 83% of the time, you know that 83% of the time I'm going to be correct. That's predictive, and so that has a higher decision value. So we calculated this for each participant on each trial, and then we regressed that learning metric to against a brain signal. And these data tell us that the task was reliable. So as expected, in both the, I'm trying to remember what I didn't include the key on here, I'm sorry. But anyway, what you need to know is that the participants attributed greater predictive or decision value to the predictive stimuli. We found that, unsurprisingly, there was distinct brain activation to predictive versus non-predictive stimuli. So for the predictive stimuli, you see activation mostly in motor regions, whereas in the non-predictive stimuli, then you start to see engagement of the cingulate, which helps resolve conflict, because your brain is saying, I can't predict what purple circle this bin belongs into. There's also engagement of some inferior frontal regions, probably trying to identify the correct answer. However, here in this whole brain analysis, there was no difference in brain activation to the predictive or non-predictive as based on anxiety severity. So what we did next is to focus on the striatum. The striatum is crucially important for learning, for probabilistic learning in particular. It's also the part of the brain that shows among the most change during adolescence. Greater activation in the striatum is thought to reflect increases in dopaminergic signaling that occurs around puberty. And interestingly, the striatum has been relatively absent from conversations about neurobiological models of anxiety. So this is a figure from a review paper Monique Ernst and her group put out a few years ago, in which they highlight the brain regions that are typically studied in anxiety, including the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the cortex. And this is part of the triadic model that she put forth many years ago. But she now is updating that triadic model to include the striatum. And the reason is because the striatum, although typically characterized as a reward center, at its core, the striatum is really involved in learning, in fear conditioning, in attention bias, in motivation, and in intolerance of uncertainty or of risk assessment and monitoring. All things that are relevant for anxiety. And so in this paper, Monique and her colleagues really call on the field to start incorporating the striatum and consider how its connections with the amygdala may inform our understanding of anxiety. And so that's what we did here. So we did a region of interest analysis on the accumbens, which is the ventral part of the striatum. Here is the ROI that we used. And what we found is that if we looked at the signaling in the nucleus accumbens during the predictive trials, how that related to their accuracy in being able to predict whether the circle went into the northern bin or the southern bin was informed by the anxiety severity. So I'll unpack that because that's a lot to say. But what you're looking at here on the x-axis is nucleus accumbens predictive index. That is, how engaged is the nucleus accumbens when you are looking at the predictive stimuli, right? And the 83% stimuli, where most of the time that purple circle is going to be a northern, in the northern bin. Now, how much activation you had in the nucleus accumbens was related to how accurate they were in appropriately binning that purple circle. But that depended on the anxiety severity. So the individuals with highest anxiety in green, if they had a lot of engagement of the nucleus accumbens, they were better at accurately predicting the stimuli. In other words, their brain picked up the probabilistic learning more accurately or more consistently if they had an engaged nucleus accumbens. For those same individuals, not for the same individuals, for individuals with equal levels of high anxiety, if they had lower engagement of the nucleus accumbens, they showed below 50% accuracy. So this means that the nucleus accumbens, in robust activation of it, especially in those kids who had the highest anxiety, the nucleus accumbens served as a glue that helped them accurately predict the stimuli in the environment. It helped them accurately bin those stimuli into the appropriate category. Staying on with this nucleus accumbens activation, we also did a regression analysis to determine whether activation in the accumbens was associated with the intolerance of uncertainty measure that we collected. And indeed, what we found is that individuals who had the highest intolerance of uncertainty were those who had the lowest engagement of the nucleus accumbens. And so here again, this, of course, we don't know the direction of the effect. These are all of the cross-sectional year 1 data. And we will certainly examine this in the year 2 and year 3 data. But what this is telling us is that not only is there a relation between accumbens activation and accuracy during predictive stimuli, but also that activation in the accumbens is associated with how comfortable you are with the uncertainty in the environment. Why does this matter? So in typically developing adolescents, and these are data collected a few years ago, not from the DAY study, in typically developing adolescents, greater activation in the accumbens is associated with greater risk-taking. So what you're looking at here are individuals who performed a reward task. They showed robust activation in the striatum. But when examined by individual differences, those with the highest activation in the very same region as I just showed you were the ones who had the highest risk-taking in real life. So but the nucleus accumbens is not just associated with risk-taking, it's also associated with better learning. In this study, again, not from the DAY study, but data collected a few years ago here at UCLA, I did a study with a colleague at Columbia, and we were interested in determining whether or not there was a benefit to having an overactive nucleus accumbens that is typically observed in adolescents. And so we asked participants to play a very simple probabilistic reward game, similar to the one I showed you before, but now we used different cues. So here participants saw a butterfly with some flowers and were told, guess which flower the butterfly prefers. Over time, they learned that when they associated the blue butterfly with the pink flower, for example, they were correct. And over time, they learned which butterfly to associate with the flower, similar to what I said before about associating the purple circle with the northern or southern bin. Early on in the task, both adolescents and adults performed okay in their learning accuracy across the first 30 trials. But over time, what emerged is that the adolescents were actually better at learning the predictive stimuli than the adults were. That is, they were better able to say, yes, the blue butterfly belongs with the pink flower, either because they're paying better attention, maybe they were more excited by the positive reinforcement, we don't know. But we surmise that perhaps it was because their nucleus accumbens, which is a key learning center, because it was showing greater activation, that helped them make the link among these predictive cue and stimulus and outcome. And indeed, that's what we found, that when we look at the both key learning centers, the striatum and the hippocampus, the adolescent brain showed greater activation than the adults when they were learning to associate these stimuli with the outcome, both in the striatum and in the hippocampus. And we collected the prediction error, and actually these data that you're looking at are the prediction errors that are regressed against the brain signal, and that's what's giving us these greater engagement of these learning systems in the adolescents versus the adults, which importantly is what we think explains this outperforming of the adolescents compared to the adults in learning. This has also been shown by other groups. So Evelina Krohn's group a few years ago also found that when they did a separate learning task similar to the ones I've described, they also found that increased striatal activity in adolescents benefits learning in the same predictive and probabilistic way. And so the main points here to take is that heightened activation in motivational and reward systems that previously was associated with poor decision-making and health compromising risk-taking actually also confers learning benefits in adolescents. Adolescents with anxiety who have greater engagement with the striatum, in other words, adolescents with anxiety who show similar engagement of the striatum as their non-anxious peers also show better performance outcomes than those who do not engage the striatum. Now, this leaves the question for me, at least, as why is it the case that some adolescents with anxiety show more engagement with striatum versus not? it could be that it's reinforcing, right? So the more you use a particular brain region, the more you're going to engage it. And so if you're not taking risks, if you're not seeking opportunities to be in an uncertain environment, then you're not engaging the striatum as much as kids who are in those spaces despite their anxiety. Wait, how am I doing on time? I feel like I'm going on and on. Tara, what do you think? Should I?
You're good. I was hoping you would do a little of the sleep.
Okay, cool. Good. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sleep because we've collected sleep on our participants in the day study, and we are super excited to look at it, especially as it relates both to anxiety and to risk taking, because as you know, sleep matters for everything, and particularly during adolescence, when the very systems that are changing are also targeted by poor sleep or sleep deprivation. The National Science Foundation or Sleep Foundation even goes so far as to say that there's a sleep epidemic among adolescents because they aren't getting enough sleep. So how does this relate back to the striatum? Well, here again, the striatum is one of those brain regions that is targeted when people do not get enough sleep. So in adults, sleep deprivation leads to overengagement of the striatum. And in a lot of work that's been done about Berkeley, they've shown that when adults are sleep deprived, the level of engagement of the striatum is comparable to the normative level of engagement of the adolescent striatum. That, in other words, it kind of reverts back the striatum to this younger state. And so in a study that my graduate student Amanda Baker did, she was interested in whether or not sleep can buffer against risky decisions. And the reason she asked this question is because, again, both in the adult samples and some of the adolescent samples we've had, when people do not get enough sleep, they show even greater risk-taking behavior than they would when they've gotten good quality or a lot of sleep. And so might it be the case that those who do get more sleep are less likely to take risks? She focused in on reckless driving, and the reason that is because car accidents are the leading cause of death for US adolescents. This is a combination of both lack of driving experience and coupled with just inherent likelihood of taking more risks. And also this impacts, this may be related to sleep because often the kids who are in car accidents have a history of sleep deprivation or happen to have been sleep deprived. Okay, I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time. So what we did is we collected sleep quality, sensation seeking, and participants did simulated risky driving task, the Larry Steinberg driving task in the scanner. So here's the task, and basically I think all of you know this, but you're on a simulated course, and you're either stopping at a red light, going on a green light, and you're asked to choose whether you take a risk on a yellow light, you run the light, or you stop and make the cautious choice. What Amanda found is that risky driving on the task was associated with real world risky driving as based on self-report. She also found that there was great variation in the sleep quality among these kids, and also variation in the percentage of times they ran that yellow light. In other words, made risky choices. And what she found is a broad network of regions were active during the risky decision making, unsurprisingly, given what we know about the systems involved during risky decision making. But here's what we found most interesting, and that is that if you look at, let's look at the bar or the graph on the right. So sleep quality divided up into better sleep versus worse sleep. And this isn't just sleep duration, but the quality of the sleep. How many times did you wake up during the night? Those who had greater activation of the ventral striatum during risk taking are shown here, the open circles. Those kids who had the worst sleep were the ones who showed the greatest number of risky choices. Now, those same kids, if they just normatively are walking around with greater and overactive or more active ventral striatum, but they got better sleep, they had good sleep quality, were less likely to make those risky choices. And so this tells us that activation in the ventral striatum may actually help buffer against, that sleep quality may actually help buffer against ventral striatum related risk taking during this simulated driving task. So I will just quickly summarize that perhaps sleep has a potential to diminish risky driving behaviors, or at least, behaviors in this driving domain. And we're eager to see how and whether there's a relation between sleep, ventral striatal activation, and risk-taking behavior or risk-avoidant behavior in our anxious youth. Okay, so with that, I think I will stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great talk. You already have questions coming in, so let me just go scroll down and take a look. And I'll remind those of you in attendance that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom part of your screen to submit your questions. The first question says, regarding anxiety and risk, is the caudate also involved or activated, or is it primarily ventral striatum, nucleus accumbens?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's primarily the ventral striatum. Where we see the caudate is more on simple learning tasks. So we do see it, but when there's a risk component or reward component involved, we actually don't see the caudate as much.
All right. The next question, in pilot data from our 2014 study, it says high anxiety individuals showed greater engagement at the amygdala in contrast to greater striatal activity in low anxiety. Did this trade-off replicate? And have you looked at striatal amygdala connectivity?
High anxiety individuals showed greater engagement. Yeah.
Yeah, it's easier.
Yeah, exactly. I have to read it again. Thanks, Agatha. No, we have not looked at striatal amygdala connectivity specifically in this study, but absolutely that's one of our goals. It's so interesting, and it's not done enough. And I know from my colleagues who study emotion, they're coming at it from the other perspective. They want to know how the amygdala talks to the striatum for other reasons.
All right, next up. Thanks for a super interesting talk. Was anxiety operationalized based on the scared, or how did you define it? And how does that self-report map to other domains of functioning like sleep?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Carrie. Yes, it was based on the scared, and that's right, Tara? This is Tara.
It depends on the study. So for days, we have a diagnostic assessment, but the primary recruitment tool is the scared. But for that early pilot work, we were really focused on the scared on the ADIS for diagnosis.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. How does that self-report map onto other domains, functioning sleep? I don't know if I understand that question. What the self-report from the scare?
I'm reading the question myself.
Okay. Oh. We haven't looked at that actually, have we, Tara? I don't think so.
I don't think we have.
Yeah, that's interesting though. No, we haven't. And I should say that the sleep is based on a sleep actigraphy watch that they wear for 2 weeks. So we were able to collect kind of a normative amount of sleep. And as I mentioned, it's not just sleep duration, but sleep quality, how many sleep disruptions they have.
That looks like it's it for now.
Okay. Yeah, me too.
One more, here we go. How do you explain the absence of nucleus? Do you want to read this one, Adriana?
Yeah, okay. How do I
read it out loud so that our—
How do I explain the absence of nucleus accumbens prediction accuracy relationship in low neutral anxiety teens? Is a suggestion that low anxiety teens don't rely on the nucleus accumbens predictions, or that high anxiety individuals are learning to accept risk more. I think it's the latter. I think it's a really interesting question. And, it's interesting. In our other work, where we expected non-anxious or low anxious kids similarly don't consistently rely on the nucleus accumbens to make predictions. So I don't know if they're offsetting those prediction making to other neural systems or not, since we typically are pretty centered on the accumbens. But in this case, I do think that the high anxiety kids are learning to accept risk more slowly. And it actually would be really interesting to break it up by trials to see if there's a learning curve similar to the work by Juliet that I showed.
All right, they're coming fast and furious now. Does the age, perhaps the age range is low, but any sense of how cannabis might impact striatal functioning and risk taking?
Yeah, I want to know that too. I mean, that graph I showed in the beginning about the transformation of adolescents and how they're endorsing less alcohol use. I think it's because now there's actually just an uptick in pot use. So that's, it's not that they're not doing anything, it's that they're doing something else. But that's a really good question. I don't know.
I also think it's interesting, those data on risk-taking under conditions of potential loss and gain. I wonder if those data, hopefully can help us think a bit about that subset of anxious youth who go on to be high risk takers with substance use.
Yes.
And I wonder if they perceive it as all gain because it's a way to cope with and manage their anxiety.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And Tara, I didn't make that great point. I mean, Tara's really interested in the high risk behaviors among the anxious kids, right? Because for them, as you're saying, that may not be the threat. The threat is being without any
humans,
in the real world. So anyway, we'll see.
All right, next question. The assumption seems to be that anxiety drives risk taking, but could anxiety be generated by previous failure experiences? What I'm getting at is the transactional relationship between anxiety and the environment. And finally, did IQ relate to outcome?
Yeah, that is so interesting. Yeah, I would have to think about that. But I think that goes along with a little bit of what I was saying, that it's the previous experiences that are really going to matter over time, right? And so is it the case that they have so many previous failure experiences that they are kind of conditioned against taking the risks? Or is it the case that they're not engaging in enough failure experiences to not appropriately engage these systems? And that's what I think is really interesting, and we'll find out over time using the longitudinal data.
Yeah, and I'll just add that in applying for this grant, the reviewers really commented on kind of the age band for our sample. And we got a lot of feedback of them wanting us to start earlier because I think there's a lot of focus on that early temperament and those kind of stable features that we see early in life that are predictive over time. And so the feedback from reviewers seemed to focus on the idea that there were biological underpinnings that were probably salient and significant very, very early in the lifespan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think when we first submitted it, we started with like 16 to 25. I mean, it went way
like lower. And we had to really argue for lots of arguments about what captures the transition into adolescence.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Could you provide any suggestions for helping high anxiety adolescents take more social risks?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think that here's where the scaffolding is so important. And Tara, I want you to chime in too. But exactly, taking more social risk and thinking about what is risky to an adolescent may not be risky to us. And so engaging with peers is a super good way to do it. Giving them little bits of autonomy and independence. So for example, riding the bus by yourself somewhere is really thrilling when you are young, and without the first time you don't have a parent around, and that kind of satisfies this itch to do something risky and a little bit scary, but it's still safe. But those types of scaffolded risk-taking experiences are those that are what we need to identify, I think.
And that's really what happens in treatment for anxious youth. It's really a focus on gradually confronting anxiety-provoking situations, practicing through exposure, and that scaffolding that you described, hopefully promoting new learning.
Mm-hmm.
All right. When you examined the ventral striatal activity to risk-taking in relation to sleep, how did you control for the quality of sleep the adolescent had the night before the imaging visit?
Yeah, that is such a bear. It always is such an issue. And that's why we don't just collect the sleep quality from one snapshot in time, because we know sleep is so variable throughout the day or throughout the week. And so we collect kind of an average of that person over 2 weeks, and then use that to control in the analysis as well as the night before.
Did you track substance use in your population?
I don't think we do. No, we do, but they're little at this age.
Yeah, we have our risk-taking measure that captures it there. So not specific separate measure, but we have it tracked.
Yeah, but yeah, base rates are low at this point, but I'm sure as the ones who started at 13 and now 16 will probably see more variation there.
Any interest in effort processing and how that relates to reward valuation in adolescence? What about entertaining counterfactuals and alternate responses, or inhibition of prepotent responding, and how that develops?
I'm so excited about studying effort. We did a recent study, not in the sample, about effort, and find that compared to adults, the adolescents were more likely to engage in effortful behavior if there was a reward associated to it, right? And that is unsurprising given that in all the different studies that we've done, it seems that the reward is front and center, right? Regardless of the potential punishment, regardless of the effort involved, regardless of who else is in the room, what matters is that there is a potential reward. So anyway, we haven't yet, but we will.
These are so fun. Would you expect similar patterns with more socially oriented or embedded risk-taking tasks?
Similar pattern. Yeah, I think that I would expect actually more risk-taking if those social stimuli are meaningful. And I think that's the trick here. Like, what is a meaningful social stimuli? So when it's an adolescent, it's typically your own peers that are the most meaningful. And I think that those stakes are higher than, showing them a picture of a coin, which we can have a whole conversation about the ecological validity of that. But it seems to be the case that the brain does, especially the striatum, doesn't discriminate. It treats every reward, every risk with the same neural mechanism. And so we at least know that we're tapping into the same circuitry, regardless of the actual stimulus in front of them.
Any comments or conjectures based on your work about risk-taking online and social media?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, actually, what I just said before, is that risk-taking is risk-taking is risk-taking. The medium may change and some of it may have different consequences, but it will all, come back to the striatum, which is why we care so much about it.
All right. How do you think helicopter caregiving is impacting risk-taking behavior in adolescents?
I think it's dampening normative risk-taking behavior. So, sometimes we're so afraid of our kids getting hurt, either socially or emotionally or physically, that we kind of try to shield them from that. Tara knows that my daughter broke her arm last night doing gymnastics. And the first thing my mom said is, "This is why I always took care of you guys. I never let you guys do this stuff." And I think that's such a bad attitude because I never did anything risky because there was such a fear. So it certainly impacts the natural inclination to take risks.
Yeah, and it sends a message that that they can't do it, or that you're uncertain of their ability to handle novelty or challenging situations.
That's exactly right. You're right. That's the more important message, that you don't have confidence in them to be able to either not get harmed, or when they do, that they won't be able to bounce back from it. But,
I think that is it.
cool, right on time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. And thanks to all of you who made the time to attend today.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Keep sending us these great questions, Tara and I.
I know. I feel like everyone's writing our next grant.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. I think you'll all get the follow-up email with the survey questions for your CME. But thanks again. Oh, wait, hang on, one more.
Oh, yeah.
Just a thank you. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.